Hey everybody, my name is Richard Smith. I'm the director of the Tank Museum. This week marks the 75th anniversary of VE Day, and today we're going to look at one incident which provides an insight into how the British defeat the German army in the Second World War. The incident that we're going to be looking at today will be well known to a number of people watching this video. What we're going to be talking about is two soldiers and two tanks and how the British, with a little bit of help from others, win the war. And for the sake of the argument, I'm going to be treating the Canadians as honorary British. They, I'm sure, would appreciate that. And to be honest, anyone else who's on the winning side counts as honorary British. Now, the two soldiers we're going to be looking at today could not have been more different. The first one is a chap called Michael Wittmann. He was one of the most famous tank commanders of the Second World War. Wittmann was credited with over 140 tank kills for the German army. He was a professional soldier. He served with the SS Leibstandarte, which was kind of Hitler's bodyguard. He was a decorated propaganda hero. There's a story of when he met Hitler to receive one of his versions of the Knight's Cross. Hitler noticed that Wittmann was missing a tooth and arranged for his own dentist to fix Wittmann's teeth in time for the wedding. And this guy, Michael Wittmann, is broadly seen then and now as the pinnacle of the Nazi war machine. Our second soldier has rarely been touted as the pinnacle of the British war machine. His name was Joe Ekins. Now, Joe was someone we got to know very well here at the Tank Museum over many years. Joe worked in a shoe factory at the beginning of the war. And he worked in Northamptonshire, which is the traditional home of British shoemaking. The factory that Joe worked in actually made army boots. And Joe was what's known as a reserved profession. And in a reserved profession, you don't have to join the army. You're kind of protected from joining the army. So Joe could have stayed the entire war in relative safety. However, he chose to join up. He volunteered because he'd seen what the Nazis had been doing in Europe and felt that it was the right thing to do his part to try and stop them. So Joe joined the local regiment. He joined the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, an organisation that at the time described themselves as a hunting regiment, which shows how seriously they took mechanisation. He came down to Bovington, where we are, to train on tanks. And he trained in all areas of tank operations, driving, communications and gunnery. Joe wasn't awfully impressed by the level of training he received. He recalled later that they only went to the ranges a handful of times to practice gunnery, and each time they went to the ranges, they only fired about 5 shots. However, he completed his training and then went to Normandy and to serve as the gunner on a Sherman Firefly. And even on this transition, he identified the fact they only went to the ranges once with the Firefly for the familiarisation. And he fired a grand total of 5 practice shots from the Firefly. So you've got two soldiers, pinnacle of the Nazi war machine, Michael Wittmann, and Joe Ekins, reluctant amateur. And on the 8th of August 1944, Joe went into his first major action and came across Michael Wittmann. Now, the action that he was taking part in was an operation called Operation Totalizers. And Operation Totalizers was one of a series of battles fought by the British to try and smash their way out of the Normandy beachhead. Now, during this process, they seem to have developed an odd habit of naming battles after horse races, which I must say I'm still slightly mystified about. But breaking out of the Normandy beachhead was no easy task, and the British learned some very, very hard lessons along the way as they moved from operational naivety to become a genuinely formidable fighting force. At the beginning of these breakout attempts, the British are essentially far too easily caught out. Operation Perch, named after a fish, in mid-June, the British trying to punch their way out of the beachhead initially went quite well. And having done quite well and reached their initial objective, they stopped for a cup of tea at a place called villers-bocage. And as an illustration of German dastardliness, the Germans then counterattack while the British are having tea. It's an appalling war crime. And the German counterattack at villers-bocage was led by Michael Wittmann. And Wittmann essentially takes on the majority of a British armoured brigade. He goes down the middle of the high street in villers-bocage, taking out British tanks and armoured vehicles. And Wittmann's in a Tiger I, arguably the most formidable fighting machine in the world at the time. And an example of how formidable this was as he was driving down the high street of villers-bocage, down a side road, there's a British tank commander, a guy called Pat Dyas. And Pat Dyas sees this Tiger drive down the road at the end of the street that he's on, and realises there's a bit of a problem going on here. So Dyas gathers his crew together, which takes him a little while because his gunner's gone for a wee. And he gets his crew together, he gets into his Cromwell tank, and they set off to pursue Wittmann in his Tiger. Unfortunately for Pat Dyas, by the time he's got his crew together, Wittmann has clearly got bored and has turned round and is coming back the other way. And Pat Dyas accounts for the next few minutes with these words. He says, I saw the Tiger coming down the street towards me. I fired at him twice. Both shots bounced off, which was a bit disheartening. The Tiger then fired at me once, and his shot did not bounce off. And Pat Dyas continues to say how he gets blown out of the top of the turret and most of his crew are killed. So Wittmann, he's led this astonishing counterattack at villers-bocage. This is the pinnacle of his reputation. This guy is a formidable operator. But by the time we get to the 8th of August, things have changed, and the British in particular have become significantly more sophisticated. So Operation Totalize is quite different. Operation Totalize is a night attack led by the Canadians, as I said, honorary British. And it uses all sorts of innovations to try and overcome the difficulties that they've had in previous assaults. So they're using new types of compasses. They're orientating their attack by using a different coloured tracer at night. The fact it's a night attack at all is actually a really difficult kind of operation to perform. But they try and reduce the complexity by bouncing searchlights off the clouds to create artificial moonlight. There's a lot of thought, a lot of planning, a lot of innovation going to this attack. And once again, they punch through German lines. But instead of stopping for a brew, while they're waiting for the next phase of the attack to start, they're waiting at the spearhead of a place called Saint-Aignan. While they're waiting for that next phase, instead of stopping for a cup of tea, they're setting up the mother of all ambushes. They're getting into a position to expect that German counterattack to come in. And lo and behold, the next thing that happens is that the British have reached their target, they're waiting, and then here comes the German counterattack, led by Michael Wittmann with his company of Tigers. So you've got Joe Ekins is in an orchard, in a Firefly, waiting, and then they see this group of Tiger tanks heading towards them. What happens in the following 12 minutes is that Joe Ekins fires 5 shots and knocks out 3 Tigers. Now, this is one of the most astonishing feats of gunnery of the Second World War, is hitting these guys from roughly double the normal range for an engagement for tanks in Normandy. Joe is clearly a natural shot. And this is in a period, remember, when the accepted exchange rate between Tigers and Shermans was to lose at least 3 Shermans, knock out 1 Tiger. Joe's taking out 3 in 5 shots. He actually subsequently takes on a 4th German tank, Panzer IV, later on in the same day. Now, the 3 Tiger tanks that Joe Ekins knocked out probably included Michael Wittmann. Opinions do vary on this. You can tell from the documentary makers. So if there's a documentary done by someone with a Canadian accent, they assume that Wittmann is knocked out by the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. If your documentary maker has a British accent, then Michael Wittmann is knocked out by Joe Ekins. You'll notice I have a British accent. There are no Canadians on this video, and therefore, for the sake of this video, I win. Joe Ekins knocks out Michael Wittmann. Now, as I said, this is one of the great acts of gunnery of the Second World War. This is an astonishing feat for someone with such little practice time as Joe. It is, of course, the British Army that Joe is part of, and therefore, having carried out one of the great acts of gunnery of the Second World War, literally the next day, Joe was transferred to being a radio operator and never fired another shot. He remained slightly cheesed off about that pretty much until he died. So, but let's reflect on this. What does this incident mean? So the key part here is Joe wins. So Joe Ekins, the reluctant amateur, takes on and defeats the pinnacle of the Nazi war machine. But he doesn't win because he gets lucky. He wins for very good reasons. And I think there are 3 reasons that Joe wins that day. And those are 3 reasons that also echo throughout the Northwest European campaign and the defeat of Nazi Germany. My first reason for Joe's victory that day is that Joe is in a good piece of equipment. So Joe is in a Sherman Firefly, and this is one of my favourite examples of British engineering and how it works during wartime. So what you've got the Sherman Firefly is you take a whole bunch of existing things, really good platform in a Sherman. It's a reliable, cost-efficient, easy to maintain, easy to operate vehicle, but it's undergunned. But the British also have this great big anti-tank gun, the 17-pounder. And with the Sherman Firefly, somehow they managed to fix this huge 17-pounder gun into a Sherman chassis and produce a really good tank killer. And that 17-pounder gun, arguably the best gun of the time in the Second World War. It's a higher muzzle velocity than the Tiger's 88. And with the armour-piercing discarding sabot round, this is a really, really efficient tank-killing weapon. So Joe is in a good tank. The Sherman Firefly, this shows the myth of Allied tanks not being good enough. This was a tank that really was good enough. Secondly, Joe's operating in what I consider to be a superior tactical system to that of his opponent. Now, this for me is where it gets really interesting. You see, the British Army in Normandy was a learning organisation, and the British Army learns quicker than the German army. This is the same with the Americans as well. You see, at villers-bocage, the British have been caught out by a counterattack. So the German doctrine is, if you get attacked, you immediately counterattack to retake that ground. Now, only a few weeks later, between 13th of June and 8th of August, you can see how much the British have learned, that instead of just having a cup of tea and waiting, that they're setting up their ambush, they're expecting that German counterattack. And it comes down to doctrine and how it works. Now, if you want to learn more about doctrine, how it works, and the effectiveness of armour in Normandy for the British, I really recommend the work of a guy called Professor John Buckley at Wolverhampton University. He's done some really excellent work in this area. So what you've got here with doctrine is that everybody who fights in Normandy, everyone who fights in the Northwest European campaign goes in with loads of doctrine. Nobody is short of doctrine in the Second World War. And the commonality across everyone's doctrine is that everyone's doctrine turns out to be wrong, because no one was expecting to fight in the bocage, in this close Normandy countryside. So all of the doctrine, even though it had been written by the best people available to everyone at the time, it's all wrong. So therefore, the real challenge is who can get rid of that wrong doctrine quickly and come up with something new. And then what this comes down to is how different people view doctrine and rules. So you see, Germans love rules. So Germans are great at doing doctrine. The British are quite different. The British, when you present them with a set of rules, treat your new rules as an interesting suggestion, but have you thought of, and then they come up with something quite sensible. It's one of the things that makes us really difficult to manage. But because of this kind of sceptical British approach to rules, it turns out that if the doctrine is wrong, you can revise the way you work really rather quickly. And if you want to look closely at how the British go about fighting in Normandy, what's actually happening on the ground is really rather sophisticated. So the doctrine is wrong, but you get individual units and subunits coming up with new methods of fighting, which are absolutely bleeding edge. You're talking about integral artillery, regimental and squadron level. You're talking really sophisticated infantry tank cooperation, again at this low level. The formation of battle groups is all going on in the British Army, but it's just not documented very well because the guys are winging it. So this meant that the British Army could evolve very quickly and was nowadays what we call a highly agile organisation. The Germans actually can't get their heads around the fact that their opponent is evolving quickly, and that means the Germans themselves prove very vulnerable. And Wittmann himself is a great example of how the Germans do not evolve and therefore get defeated. And actually, the American historian Stephen Zaloga makes the, what I think, key observation that when the Germans are fighting against the British in Normandy, Michael Wittmann, for all his skill and all his reputation, Michael Wittmann only lasts 2 months. So we've got a good piece of equipment, we've got a superior tactical system, but the third, and for me, arguably the most important feature that explains how the British win against the Germans in Normandy is this one, and that's that Joe Ekins was in the most dangerous place in the world that day. He was not only at the front between the two fighting forces in Normandy, but he was at the Schwerpunkt. He was at the absolute tip of the focus of a German counterattack. This was a lethal place to be. And Joe was from a liberal democracy. He was a volunteer chosen to be there. And if he'd run away, he would not have been shot. But Joe chose to be brave and chose to fight. And when we reflect on this, it was not that Joe wasn't scared. I said in an earlier video, I asked Joe what it was like that day, and his response was bloody frightening, I can tell you. And after the event, he was saying that he was physically shaking. There was a combination of fear and adrenaline. This was a terrifying experience, but Joe fought it out in the most dangerous place in the world, at the front of the battle. Now, there were brave men on all sides in every army in World War II. But Joe was on the right side of history. If it hadn't been for Joe and thousands of people like him, the world would look like a very, very different place today. And VE Day and the commemorations that we have this week would simply not have been possible. That's not the end of our story, because Joe was never formally recognised for what he did, and his account of it he gave to me later on was that in his unit that day only one guy got a medal, and that was actually the commander of his tank who'd got injured and had gone to the back. So Joe never got formally recognised, but when we opened our tank story hall, the centrepiece of the Tank Museum in 2009, the Queen came down to do the opening. And we had the opportunity to introduce a number of people to her. And that day, we only introduced one veteran to the Queen, and that was Joe. And Joe had the opportunity in person to tell his story to the Queen. And I spoke to him afterwards, and he said that that day had been the proudest day of his life. And when I think about why we operate the Tank Museum, why we tell the stories we tell, why we do what we do, I look at that moment and I say, that's why. Thank you very much. Here at the Tank Museum, we are trying to produce a wider range of online content while the museum is closed because of coronavirus. Over this period, it would be wonderful if you could support us through any means that you can, in particular through Patreon, through joining our friends, or through buying things like Tank Museum slippers in our online shop. Thank you very much for your support.